Welcome back to Imagine Aviation. I really hope you enjoyed that last panel discussion with the students. And don't forget, if you want to continue conversations with any of those students or any of the people you see today, please join us in Gathertown after the session today. You can do so by going to the Imagine Aviation website and click the Gather Experience button specifically for instructions on how to join. And there's also a link in the YouTube chat with instructions. And now, it's my sincere pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today. Adam Ruben is a writer, comedian, storyteller, and molecular biologist. For over 20 years, he has performed at clubs, colleges, and private venues across North America and Europe, including at some of the best-known storytelling shows and comedy clubs around. He is the author of Surviving Your Stupid Decisions to Go to Grad School, a satirical guide to the low points and, well, the lower points of post-baccalaureate education, as well as Pinball Wizards, Jackpots, Drains, and the Cult of the Silver Ball, a narrative nonfiction book about the past, present, and future of pinball. Adam will also be taking questions, so don't forget to go to the I.O. tool at arc.cnf.io to enter your questions. So without further ado, Adam Ruben. Adam, please take it away, sir.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody, for having me today. Really appreciate it. I was very excited to learn to be speaking at NASA. It turns out at NASA just means in my basement. So here I am. Welcome to my basement. Today I'm going to be talking about the public perception of science and also of scientists. And just want to thank in advance those who are running my slides for me. You'll probably hear me say, next slide, please, a lot during this because it's just kind of the smoothest way to do it. So next slide, please. As scientists, we have this misperception sometimes, or at least I know I did when I first went into science, that the world is grateful for all of the advances we announce. That we announce some new breakthrough and everyone says, yay, that's terrific. Thank you, wonderful scientists. But as we know, this is not always the case. And I think this past couple of years has shown us that more prominently than anything. Next, please. And I'm going to be talking about the way that people think about science and the way that people misperceive science. And the first time I ever thought about this was in 2000. I was in college. I was in my lab. I was staring out the window. I was listening to NPR. And they just announced the completion of the Human Genome Project. And I thought people were going to be calling in and talking about how wonderful this is, that we've hit this big scientific milestone. But instead, people were calling in and saying, you shouldn't have done this. And I looked for a transcript. I found one. This is just one example of what someone called in and said. Pete from St. Louis found it disturbing because he was afraid that scientists would start using the human genome for war purposes to manipulate people as they see fit, which had nothing to do with what the Human Genome Project was or even could do. It was some misperceived sci-fi. So I started thinking about how is it that we think about science in the wrong way sometimes? And you can possibly tell by the background of all of these slides where this is going. We're going to be talking about one particular event, one announcement in science, a particular scientific advance that happens to have taken place 1 week and 25 years ago. That illustrates a lot about how people think about science. So next, please. Before we do that, usually when I give a talk like this, I start talking about something else, this thing called the Coalition to Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide. Now, a lot of you may have heard of this already. When I'm in a room full of live people, I ask those who know what this is not to say anything and not to giggle. But I have them read through this slide, take a few minutes, see everything on here. This is all true information about a chemical called dihydrogen monoxide, or DHMO. And then next, please, I asked them to take a quick survey. Should DHMO, based on all of this, the fact that it can cause extreme burns at high temperatures, should it be allowed, regulated by the government in some way or by industry, or should it be banned? And we take a survey, and then we later reveal that dihydrogen monoxide, DHMO, is dihydrogen, 2 hydrogens, monoxide, 1 oxygen, H2O. It's water. And so those of you who would have voted to regulate or ban this commodity in some way based on fear would have just regulated or banned water. So what is the Coalition to Ban Dihydrogen Monoxide? It's kind of like an early internet joke before the internet. It started out, the first instance of this I've ever found is in an April Fool's issue of something called the Durand Express, warning about dihydrogen monoxide in the water pipes. Next, please. It came to national prominence in 1990 when a couple of students on the UC Santa Cruz campus publicized their efforts to circulate a petition, getting it banned, again, as a joke. And next, please. And then in 1997, again, when a high school student won first prize at the Greater Idaho Falls Science Fair for getting his classmates to sign something banning this chemical. And the title of his project was How Gullible Are We? Next, please. And this sounds like a silly example, but I start with this because even this silly example comes into the real world sometimes. And so you can see, click twice, please. There are examples all over the place of times when just this dihydrogen monoxide ends up in the news again because someone makes a joke and people think it's a huge problem. Most recently in Florida, some DJs were fired because they were warning people on April Fool's Day that there is dihydrogen monoxide in the water supply. Next, please. So we're going to switch to the next survey question that I typically ask. And again, in this format, we really can't do that because I can't hear or see you. But this is just to tell you how this question typically goes. This is a question that I took from a reproductive biotechnology class that I took in college. So Dr. Lee Silver taught this class, and he always did this survey with his students. First, he asked them, okay, I'm going to name a reproductive biotechnology, and you tell me whether you think this should be allowed for everybody or only allowed for infertile couples to create a child who have no other means of doing so, or banned across the board. And first he asks about IVF, in vitro fertilization. And usually most people think that it should be allowed for whoever wishes to use it to have a child. Number two is the use of cloning technology to produce human children. And again, this time it's kind of reversed. Most people say absolutely not. This seems like science fiction. This is too far. And then he puts up number three. And I want you to take the time for a moment to read the wording of number three. A woman producing and carrying to term an embryo that contains genetic material obtained entirely from one of her own cells. And this one tends to get a pretty mixed response. But what's interesting is that a lot of people change their minds between number two and number three. And there is a name for number three, and that name is cloning. And so anyone who changed their minds between number two and number three changed their minds only based on perception and not based on science. And that's the point that he tries to make, and that I've found repeated in audience after audience, where cloning has scary associations with it. But number three, when it's described that way, doesn't sound so bad. So next, please. We're going to look at what cloning actually is. Next, please. This is how you began. This is when you were a single cell. That's an egg with a nucleus. The nucleus has DNA. The DNA is a little scratchy stuff. Next, please. And then let's just click through the whole slide, please. So that egg divided into two, and then divided into four, and then eventually into the, go back, please, into the trillion or so cells that make up an adult human now. And what's interesting is that each one of those cells in your body has the same DNA. Same recipe book, whether that cell is a hair cell or a tooth cell or a skin cell or a red blood cell, it has the same DNA. It just makes more or less of some different recipes. So next, please. Here's what cloning is. If you start with that one egg and that those two individual eggs, when one becomes two, if those happen to fall apart from each other, then you get identical twins, assuming both of them make it out the other side. For cloning, what you do is you take an already differentiated cell, a cell that has already decided what it's going to become. In this case, let's say a square skin cell. And click, please. You remove the DNA from that cell. You remove the DNA from that cell and you put it into a different egg. Click, please. It's a little hard with the animations without the control, but you get the idea. So you take someone else's egg, you take out the DNA, and then you move the DNA from your skin cell into that egg. I'm using skin as an example. Click, please. And then you start that egg dividing to two, and click, please, so on. That's what cloning is. So basically, a clone is like an identical twin that is born a generation later. So next, please. To make sure that people understand this, what I typically ask next is, all right, if I clone you right now and you're exactly 18 years old today, how old will your clone be 1 year from today? So take a moment to think about that answer. Okay, and so at this point, people will start shouting answers out, and click, please. 19 years old is the wrong guessed answer. Click, please. The wrong answer is 1 year old because there's one other step that your clone has to undergo. Click, please. 3 months old. So if I were to clone you right now, that clone is a single cell and still has to gestate for 9 months inside a woman. In the book Brave New World, there are giant rooms that serve as artificial wombs, but that doesn't exist in real life, at least not yet. A clone still must mature inside a woman. So we're going to go a little fast here as we're running out of time. Click, please. Might skip past a couple things. So now that you know this, you know what some of the myths about cloning could be. The clone is an exact copy of the original, for example, right? You think clone, you think copy. This is CC. CC is short for copycat or carbon copy. The world's first cloned kitten. Next, please. This is CC with her surrogate mother, Allie. That's the cat in whose womb CC gestated. And let's see the cat that CC was cloned from. Next, please. That is CC's genetic, quote unquote, mother or genetic progenitor, Rainbow. That's the cat that CC was cloned from. Now, if you look at CC and Rainbow, they don't even look the same, right? CC has this sort of tortoiseshell pattern and Rainbow has this calico pattern. So I thought that clones are identical twins. So even if they're not the same individual and they're not the same age, shouldn't they at least look identical? And the answer is that cat fur colors are determined partially by conditions in the womb. So I use this to illustrate that as early as pre-birth, clones have differences that you can see to show that they are a different creature and not just the same creature again. Click, please. There's a myth about cloning involving the manipulation of genetic traits, but it's not. It's about keeping the traits the same. Genetic engineering is the manipulation of traits, and that's different. Next, please. There's also this myth about creating an army of clones. Let's say you want to create an army of 100,000 clones. What is the first ingredient you would need? 100,000 women, right? All of them willing to donate their wombs to this project. And then, if all goes well, 9 months from now, you'd have 100,000 babies. And then you'd have to raise them for the next 18 years and then convince them to join your army. It's a lot easier to find traditional 18-year-olds made the old-fashioned way and convince them to join an army than it would be to ever make an army of clones. Next, please. This is the original article announcing the world's first mammal cloned from a differentiated adult cell. And like I said, it just so happens that last week was the 25th anniversary, not even last week, just a couple days ago, 25th anniversary of the publication of this article. Dolly the sheep was the world's first clone. There she is in the picture in white. This is the Nature article in which she was announced. You will notice if you read the whole article, which you shouldn't because it's a boring scientific article, that the scientists who cloned Dolly used the word clone or its variants, cloning, cloned, cloners, a grand total of 0 times. They never say clone. They say somatic cell nuclear transfer, the transfer of a nucleus of a somatic cell. But here's why we're talking about Dolly, because as soon as this little scientific article got into the mainstream media, things went crazy. Next, please. This is Time Magazine's cover when Dolly was announced, and I use this to illustrate a lot of different things that the media did wrong with the announcement of Dolly. So first of all, you've got this sheep face and a big sheep face next to it. It's just showing sheep can become another sheep. Now, when Dolly was born, she was a lamb. She was a baby. But this cover, even though it doesn't say it directly, it implies that you've got this second sheep of the same age. If you look in the background of Time Magazine's cover, you'll see the same sheep face repeated several times, implying you can make 1, you can make 2, you can make hundreds. You've got a fiction bonus, Clone on the Range by Douglas Coupland, which I've read. It's not very good. And there's nothing wrong with Time publishing fiction, but it didn't hurt to support this idea that we are now living in an era of science fiction. Then finally, in the lower right, will there ever be another U? So besides the puns on YOU and EWE that were everywhere, so many media articles at this time said, yes, a sheep has been cloned, but could people be next? Let's take a look at some of those. Next, please. Oh, actually, before we do those, I just want to show you that the German magazine at the time, Der Spiegel, was a little less subtle. Germans are not known for their subtlety. So you've got Dolly, and then that's Hitler, Einstein, and I'm told that that's Claudia Schiffer. Those are the big 3 that I suppose you'd have to worry about cloning. And then click, please. The German translates to Science on the Way to Cloned People, The Fall of Man, or Sündenfall. Next, please. So these are some of the media images that were used in the announcement of the birth of Cece in, I believe, 2002. There's Cece in a beaker showing she's a product of science and not of nature. There she is staring into a mirror as if she is asking, should I be? And then the worst one is the one from the BBC in the lower right, which isn't even the right cat. Next, please. Here are the headlines about Dolly. Scottish scientists clone adult sheep. Techniques used with humans is feared. Potential ethical nightmare. Hello, Dolly. Bye-bye, daddy. Men are not needed anymore for reproduction. First cloned lamb paves way for life by production lines. A bit of a leap. And then Scottish scientists use cells of sheep and create exact copy, which of course Dolly was not an exact copy any more than identical twins are copies of each other. And these are page A1, page A01, page 1. This was not small news at the time. Next, please. In fact, there's a great editorial, and by great I mean terrible, but just great to illustrate this point. In USA Today, Craig Wilson writes this whole thing about how he opposes cloning. It's scary to him. And one of the things he writes is clone murders could become commonplace. But what happens then? Are you charged with murder or suicide? And you would think that people would read this and say, yeah, okay, haha, that's kind of funny. But you know people are reading this and saying, yes, Craig Wilson, you ask the tough questions. You ask these questions that these scientists don't want to ask. Next, please. So this is from the Weekly World News. Those of you who are not of a certain age may not know what the Weekly World News is, but it used to be when you checked out at the supermarket, there would be all of these strange newspapers next to the checkout counter, and one of them was a Weekly World News. Dolly the cloned lamb kills a sheep, kills a lamb, and eats it. Next, please. This is Dolly Today. Dolly died in 2003, or rather she was euthanized in 2003. She had a lung disease. There was skepticism about, was it because she was a clone that she became sick at a young age? But lots of sheep get the same disease, so who knows? Her wool has been made into a sweater, or as the British call it, a jumper. But even in death, Dolly is immortalized with this sheep, two sheep motif. You see the two sheep on the front, 1 + 1 = 2 on the bottom. Misconceptions even emblazoned in Dolly's very wool itself. Next, please. And this keeps coming back. Cloning the gastric brooding frog, you may have read this about 9 years ago, is big news because this frog, gastric brooding, so gastric stomach or mouth in this case, brooding, it keeps its brood in its mouth. That's why that one on the right looks so freaky. It's not eating another frog, that's just where it carries its baby. And the paperclip is just for scale. But this came into prominence because this was the first time scientists had successfully cloned an extinct animal. And the gastric brooding frog had been extinct since, I believe, the 70s, but there was some tissue remaining in lab freezers, and they were able to bring the gastric brooding frog back, not back to life, because the dead thing didn't come back to life, but to create new gastric brooding frogs. And what do you think happened in the media when scientists brought an extinct animal back to life? Next slide, please. Well, scientists clone extinct frog, Jurassic Park, here we come. Next, please. New York Times, your extinct scientists have gleam in eye. How many people trust a scientist with a gleam in their eye? And French Tribune, from dead to alive, science magic. Next, please. You might have read this too. I saw this on Facebook just from scrolling. There was this big thing announced in 2015 that over 80% of Americans support, quote, mandatory labels on foods containing DNA. I saw this. I laughed at it the same way many people did. I include this in this talk as a means of saying, okay, let's back up for a second. It is easy to say that people don't understand science and to make fun of people for not understanding science, but that is not always the whole story. Mandatory labels on foods containing DNA, it's so easy to share this headline and say, ha ha, people are stupid. And it's based on a food survey from the Oklahoma State Department of Agricultural Economics. But next slide, please. If you actually look at that survey, it's kind of hard to see on here. These are the different do you support / do you oppose things that they had in there. Mandatory labels on foods containing DNA is fourth from the bottom. But you can see it's right next to things like mandatory labels on foods produced with genetic engineering. So what is more likely, that people really want all foods with DNA labeled that there's DNA in there, or that people read this and assumed that they meant genetic engineering? Because, click please, there's another survey from about 2011 showing that about 85% of American adults know that all plants and animals have DNA. That's actually something that people tend to know pretty well. So how could 85% of people understand this, and yet 80% want foods labeled that have DNA? So clearly there's something else going on where maybe the question was not fully understood because it may not have been phrased properly. So you always have to look deeply into them before we take the knee-jerk reaction of just saying people don't understand science, it's a shame, the end. Next, please. So why don't people trust scientists? Well, if you want to know what people think about scientists with Gleam in eye, you can just do a Google image search for the word scientist. I encourage you to try it after this. What you can see is that with only a few exceptions, people think scientists are all elderly, insane, white male chemists. That's basically what we are. We have a green bubbling beaker and we stare at it, possibly with ill intent. You can even see the different categories of scientists: clip art, in lab, famous, in lab coat, mad. We're one of only two professions that takes the adjective mad, and the others hatters, and I don't know that many hatters. Next, please. You can also figure out what people are asking about scientists by doing Google autocomplete. That's kind of fun. Why are scientists concerned about invasive species? Atheists, liberals, oh no, they found us out. Scientists are so stupid, important, arrogant, interested in solar neutrinos. I think that's because the so picked up the so in solar also. You can see it's not bold. Do scientists believe in God, ghosts, evolution, Bigfoot, which are mainly the four areas of study for most scientists: God, ghosts, evolution, and Bigfoot. Next, please. I think one of the best ways to think about what people view scientists as is this thing called a draw scientist test, which was introduced by someone named D.W. Chambers in Australia in the early 80s. Very simple. He went to elementary school classrooms and said, draw a scientist, and then saw what kids drew to see what the perception was of scientists. And you can see these are some of the pictures from his original study in 1983. You've got scientists with a, I guess that's well, they all have mustaches for one thing, but that could also just be the fact that it's 1983. You've got the beakers, and you've got this door, keep out, monster inside. Probably means monster. Maybe it's just a fridge where he keeps his cheese. Don't know. Click, please. What was interesting is the very last couple sentences of Chambers' paper, where he says, in almost every class tested, at least one child, and often as many as 4 or 5, wrote words on the walls of the lab that said things like keep out, private, do not enter, go away, top secret. There is this perception not only that scientists are these weird mythical creatures, but also that science is closed. It is something that is dangerous, and you must keep out and leave it to the crazy scientists. And that is a problem. That is a perception that scientists need to correct. We need to demonstrate to people that we are human beings, because it is possible to get to 12th grade having met lots of science teachers, but having never met a scientist. Next slide, please. And so there's a great new corollary to the Draw a Scientist test, where students draw a scientist and then go meet a scientist or a bunch of scientists and then draw a scientist again. This is one example from kids who went to Fermilab in 2000. These pictures are just online, and the before and after were drawn in each case by the same child. You can see before, they all drew someone in a lab coat, glasses, bubbling beaker, and then after, well, 2 of them actually drew normal human women, which is pretty great after just one day of meeting scientists. The one on the right, I think he just drew the rock. I don't know if he understood the assignment. But then they also asked kids, what did you learn from meeting some scientists on one day, just one day? And click, please. This is this kid who drew the rock on the right. He wrote, before meeting scientists, the scientist looks like a person in the 30s to 50s, has glasses, somewhat balding. But then after, click, please, he wrote, the scientists were like me when I was little. The scientists played sports, hung out with their friends, and also did not get straight A's in every subject. This is a kid who was mystified to discover that scientists are human beings, and all it took was one visit to meet some scientists. So one easy way scientists can convince people we're human is by meeting them. Next, please. And therefore, the lesson that I try to impart from this is that next time you hear about an amazing scientific advancement, your first response should not be to immediately dismiss it or even to immediately praise it. It should be, click please, to immediately want to go and learn more about it. And the scientists have as much a responsibility in that job as the people learning about the science. Click please. And with that, I will, oh, sorry. That's right. I forgot I had added this slide. Just to mention that we live in an era where the public perception of science is more important than it ever is. We think about the science before we do everything. I am going to possibly visit my grandmother next month. I am thinking about nothing but science when trying to figure out whether to visit my grandmother next month. What will the rates be like? Will I be tested? Will I be, am I going to be walking past unvaccinated people? Am I going to be wearing the proper mask? Do I need to wear 2 masks? Should I take a plane? But the air circulation. And so everything, and I'm sure you can all relate to this, everything we do now comes with this background of thinking about science and wondering if we're thinking about it the right way, or if we're thinking about it the science fiction way, like people did with Dolly. So click, please. With that, I will gladly take any questions that anybody has.
Thanks, Adam. That was a great and wonderfully entertaining conversation on a topic that we can relate to here in NASA. It is something I'm still struggling to understand if Dolly died before she committed that murder. But I'll take that offline with you in Gathertown, I think, because I can't wrap my head around that. But in all seriousness, we're really facing similar challenges as a scientific organization in NASA, and specifically when we talk aviation. We face some of these perception challenges in the acceptance of autonomous aviation capabilities and our artificial intelligence in general. So what do you any recommendations or thoughts of what can we do to overcome the autonomy perception and the acceptance challenges based on your experience in the biological sciences?
Sure. And I think your camera may be off. You may need to turn that back on. Yeah, so I think the best way for scientists to get people less afraid of scientists and less afraid of science is with a lot of slow, concerted effort. It was very interesting. I spoke once at Rocky Mountain Labs, which is this little NIH branch in Hamilton, Montana. It's a biosafety level 4 lab. They work with Ebola and things like that. And they're in this little mountain community that is basically local rural residents and a bunch of PhDs. And when they first moved there, there was a lot of concern. Why are you building this biosafety level 4 facility in our little town instead of in Bethesda? And I talked with the guy whose job it was basically to make sure the residents accepted the existence of the scientists. And I asked him how he did it. And he said, you just have to be as open and honest as possible and as free with information as possible. He said, anybody in town who wants to know what we're doing here, they can email me and I'll take them on a tour. They sent scientists out to have a booth at the farmers market every single week. And there's a big sign that says, ask me anything. And people would come up and ask them what they're working on, and they would explain. And he said they had to stop doing the booth, not because there's a problem, but because so many people got their questions answered that no one was coming to ask questions anymore. That's not something that happens overnight, but over a period of years, they got some of their biggest opponents to be some of their biggest supporters. And it wasn't through any kind of trickery or any magic formula. It was simply by frequent, open, honest communication and making sure that everyone knows that everyone else is a human being.
Right. No, great point. So you speak a lot about scientists, and we have scientists within NASA and our partners tuning in, but how would you compare and contrast perceptions of engineers versus scientists?
When I first was deciding to what to major in college, I had that question, and I'm someone who was raised in a scientific background. My mother is a scientist, and so I should know about this sort of thing. But then all of a sudden, you have to decide what to major in, and they tell you, okay, it's do you want to be a scientist or an engineer? And that's a hard question because what engineer? That's the guy with the stripy hat who drives the train, right? I didn't know what engineering was and how that was different from science, or if it was different from science, but it's different enough that all the schools I was applying to have like the School of Engineering and the School of everything else. So what is this engineering that's just so different? And the best answer I got was, well, engineers solve problems. Whereas scientists do what? Cause problems, exacerbate problems. So I didn't have a good answer. But I decided to major in engineering because it seemed like that's a good thing to do with problems, solve them. And I ended up dropping out of it because I didn't like it and became a scientist instead. But I think there's just so much overlap between the two that it's not worth dividing it out so much. I mean, there are applied scientists and there are exploratory scientists, right? And an engineer is not necessarily going to sit and do theoretical research just to publish in a theoretical journal. Maybe they will, actually. Maybe there are some who do that. There's enough overlap in intention that I think the bigger difference is between theory and practice, scientists and engineers who theorize versus those who work on a product or an application. So public perception of engineers, I don't think the public perceives engineers the same way they do perceive scientists, because I don't think they know what they are. You Google engineer, it's going to show you some trains, right? You Google scientist, and you're going to get this sci-fi character with the lab coat and the nerd glasses. So I think there's not as much difference as we think.
So you that's a great point, and you mentioned the personal aspect. See scientists, engineers as people, and when you get to talk and when you get to know someone, that's clearly something we can strive for. But how do we work on a mass level, on a macro level, to change society, change their perception of science, change their perceptions of scientists, of engineers, regarding many things we don't understand? A lot of the population, including myself, doesn't understand a lot of the technological brilliance that's coming out of NASA or our partners. How do you communicate those changes for things that without sending somebody through a PhD program in engineering or science?
Yeah, I mean, that's part of that's the challenge that science communication always faces. Science is complicated, and making something complicated interesting is hard. And there really is no magic formula for it. It's just a case-by-case basis, each individual thing, explaining it in the way that makes sense, that shows what the most interesting pieces are. But also, I think that as scientists, we have a responsibility to interact with the public. And there are lots of opportunities to do that. There are far fewer now, thanks to the pandemic, but once that kind of clears up, there are science cafes where you can volunteer to present your work. There are places like Ignite and Thirst and Nerd Night, which are basically people going to a bar and paying to see scientists give a half-hour talk about their work. How the hell that exists, I don't know, but it does. And I've done several of them, and they're a lot of fun because these people want to hear something interesting. And so the pressure is on you to make your stuff interesting and accessible. So I've seen talks about the chemistry of chocolate or whatever, and it's a chemistry talk, but it's also something that people are interested in hearing. And so as scientists, we should challenge ourselves to make our work sound interesting, make it accessible, and get out there and present it to people, even if it just means volunteering to do some experiments in your child's kindergarten classroom. Liquid nitrogen, if you've got some, kindergartners love it. Don't let them touch it.
I love it too. So, Adam, thank you so much. This has been great. I love the levity you bring to this. I love the conversation on a serious topic, but bringing in a component that we can all connect to. So, on behalf of everyone at NASA, I really want to thank you for spending some time with us and sharing your thoughts and presentation in Imagine Aviation. So, thank you, Adam.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the free pin.
Excellent, Adam Ruben. Thank you very much. Well, it's been